It is great being here, and of course I had to go back. I was flying back from Oakland yesterday. I was out. We have our first grandchild, out visiting he and his parents, and so went back and did some further. Of course, I had to research the Albany movement to write my thesis. My thesis was on Joseph Lowery and his 20-year term as the head of the SCLC. And of course, you know, so there's been so much written about Albany, and since there's absolutely nothing I can tell you about Albany, I'm going to stay away from Albany other than to say that it was a precursor to Birmingham, which then was led to St. Augustine. And so what I want to share with you all today is something that you may, about some of the people that you may have known a little bit less about, which are the key people from the St. Augustine movement that was the ultimate catalyst, the last building block to the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And I do understand that the Albany movement was a result of the fact that the city fathers, the city officials did not want to do several of the things that they needed to do for the black citizens of this community. I think was a subdivision called Lincoln Park, and I know that there were issues there with the streets and their inattentiveness there, and I understand that SNCC came in and there was involvement with Albany State and certainly the NAACP, which is always going to be the mother of the civil rights movement. And of course my perspective is going to come from that of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, but I'm really not going to talk about Albany. But I will touch on, for the folk who kind of may not know, is how the Southern Christian Leadership Conference kind of came to being. And as many of you all know, it was founded in 1957 by a group of mostly Southern Baptist ministers. And they had their initial meeting in Atlanta, and then they I think they were there meeting when a bomb exploded in Birmingham, and Ralph Abernathy and Dr. King had to go back to attend to that business. So they actually were later then chartered in New Orleans. And why was it important that this organization came into being? The reason was that black people were under tremendous distress, and nobody was paying any attention to it. From everything from lynchings to the fact that black people were generally relegated to the lowest pay. There were very few opportunities for advancement. Certainly we had our fine African American colleges and universities, but there were limits to where people could go and what people could do. And so when this group kind of came together, and in fact, in some of the things that I'm sure some of you all actually remember too, whereas in many of the cities of our country, a black gentleman, a man and his wife, and they could be coming out of Sunday school, and they're walking down the main street of the town, and if a white man or a white woman happened to approach them from the other side, we know in many cities and communities, they were expected to step off the sidewalk. He was expected to remove his hat and avert his eyes in deference to this white couple that, you know, in reality we know was no better than they were. And so there was this sense of subservience. There was this, they called it the tripartite system. There was economic oppression, there was political oppression, because certainly we did not have the right to vote. And there was an oppression from the perspective of Jim Crowism and keeping black folk in their place and keeping them relegated to certain places in our society. And so when these ministers came together and they got on their knees and they essentially asked God, well, say, Lord, give us some relief. What can we do to challenge this country to be what it said it is? You know what it says in our Declaration of Independence, right? It says that all men, it should say, and women, are created equal with certain inalienable rights, including life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. But was that being honored? Was that being recognized? Of course it was not. And so how is this kind of small group, this ragtag group of individuals, they had no economic power, or they had limited economic power, they had no political power, and they had no there wasn't an Oprah Winfrey show, then. There wasn't, we didn't have Bev Smith show. We didn't have all of these people who had this media venue that they could use. So they said, how can we challenge this country to be what it said it was going to be? So after they came out of this meeting and they came up with their name, and of course the name changed 3 or 4 times over the years. Does anybody here happen to know the motto of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference?
Motto?
Yeah. It is to redeem the soul of America. That is their mission and their motto. That's who they said they were created and designed. Their purpose was to redeem the soul of America. Now, to me, that is radical. Again, this is this little group of people, less than 12% of the population, with no power, relative little influence. So how are they going to do this? They were going to do this a couple ways. There were 2 or 3 tenets to who they were. Number one, they were going to be nonviolent. Whatever happened, whatever they were confronted with, they were committed to pursuing this change, to being this entity that challenged this country at its core values. They were going to do it nonviolently, and their service was to the least of these. Now, certainly were there other organizations, challenging injustice and racism and segregation? Certainly there were. There were the Urban League, there were CORE, there was FOR, there were all of these. Now, certainly the NAACP's principal methodology and their strategy was to challenge these unjust systems through the courts. They would take you to court, and they were critical and are still critical because they had that expertise, the Legal Defense Fund, and they could challenge you that way. Now, the SCLC, on the other hand, they were going to go to the streets. They were going to do grassroots, knock on doors, protests, sit-ins, and these sorts of methodology. And of course, this sprang out of the success that they developed in Montgomery with the Montgomery bus boycott. And before that, there were several other places like in Baton Rouge. So this was who the SCLC was. And so as you look back in history, the role that the Southern Christian Leadership Conference played in the passage of the Civil Rights Act of '64 and the Voting Rights Act of '65, I think is undeniable. Now, as I said, you all have this amazing history in Albany. We know what happened in Birmingham, where they turned the attack dogs and the fire hoses on the children. And one of the key strategies for the SCLC was to get children out of school and get them into the marches. And why did they do that? Because in many instances, their parents may have wanted to be involved, but they realized they had bills to pay, they had mouths to feed, and they also were concerned about the safety of their children. Because we knew how it was not at all unusual to hear that so-and-so unfortunately was grabbed, and sometimes it was by a policeman, and raped on her way home, or somebody ended up in the river. Some people, there were lynchings. I mean, the brutality knew no end. And so these parents, first and foremost, they were parents and they were concerned. But what the strategy of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference grew to be over time was the realization that as they went and got the kids, the parents had no choice but to get involved, because they had to go and help get their children out of jail, and thus many of them became activated. So as I spent my 5 years with the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, we dealt with issues like the burning of the black churches. Dr. Lowry was the very first person on record with pushing Bill Clinton, and Bill Clinton acknowledges this at one of the anniversary events that they had in Arkansas, were pushing him to raise the burning of the black churches. And you all remember this in the late 90s. And we know it goes way back before that, but they were being burned all across the country, but pushing the president to raise this to a national level of import. And so that was one of the issues that we dealt with. We dealt with disparity in sentencing. Why, if people got caught with powdered cocaine, they were getting very minute sentences, but if they got caught with crack cocaine, they were getting sentences 4 and 5 times as much. And one was a poor person's drug and one was a rich person's drug. That's the bottom line on it. We dealt with economic empowerment issues, so that why people like Publix and various other institutions, I think Shoney's was another one that we signed these economic pacts with. Why they could come into the black community, they could set up their stores, but then they wouldn't hire black managers, they wouldn't hire black supervisors and people that had ranking positions, and you couldn't have ownership of these institutions. So by pushing them and challenging them, and in some instances sitting in and withholding the dollars from them, we were able to sign $100 million pacts with all of them, Shoney's, Texaco, Publix, and there are a few others that I'm not remembering right now. So those are some of the key issues. Certainly voter education and voter registration was always absolutely at the forefront. And so as I ran around the country with the brain trust of the SCLC, I kept meeting these people, and they were 70, 80, sometimes 90 years old. And I was amazed because they had invested their entire lives into this pursuit of freedom, equality, and justice. And a lot of times they had, never did they have, none of these people that I'm thinking about, they didn't have health insurance. They didn't have 401ks. They didn't have PhD or MA or any of that stuff behind their name. A lot of times they didn't know how they're going to pay next month's light bill. And so I started asking them, I said, look, young people today, they don't know what you invested, what you sacrificed, what you gave up. So that today, if they have the grades to get into Harvard, they can live in Harvard. If they can go to school at Harvard. They can live in any neighborhood they want to. They could aspire to be Secretary of State, and today we can say even President of the United States. Those roadblocks, and not saying it's still not going to be harder. You may be harder for you as a black person, but you can do it. It's been proven that you can do it. And a lot of that is because of the sacrifices you made, because you were willing to stand out there in the hot sun with a sign and picket, and you were willing to be spat upon and beaten and sent to jail and called boy and called mammy. And you did all this so that they can have a different, better life. And I said, but they don't understand that in many instances. They don't recognize that, and they don't honor you for that. I says, are you bitter? Are you resentful? And every single one of them, when I asked them this, they got real emotional. Their voice started to quiver, and then they started to tell me, oh no, baby, it's not like that. It was such a special time in their lives to be part of this era where they tore down the Cotton Curtain. They challenged America at its core values. And because of they did what they did with such grace and such dignity, and the fact that they would do it non-violently, because there's a gentleman who you all have his picture as part of the museum, and he's one of my unsung heroes. His name is J.T. Johnson, and he always said to me, he said, look, it's hard to kill a man who's unarmed if he's challenging you in this kind of an instance. And so, because they did what they did, and I said, wow, somebody needs to tell their story. Somebody needs to help memorialize their contributions to this country and how things are different because these people lived. So that was one of the two key reasons that I pursued writing this book. And the second one, I want to share with you something that Dr. King himself said about these people. And I know everybody's perspective is different, but one of the things that I took from what I have found out about him and the people that I have spent time with who knew him well, was that he understood that it was not about him, that it was about moving this country forward and moving our race forward. And this is one of the things that he said when he accepted the Nobel Peace Prize on December 10th, 1964. He said, I accept the Nobel Peace Prize at a moment when 22 million Negroes, and you know that's what they used to call us, of the United States of America are engaged in a creative battle to end the long night of racial injustice. He said, I accept this award on behalf of the civil rights movement, which is moving with determination and a majestic scorn for risk and danger in order to establish a reign of freedom and a role of justice. And this is the important part. He says, from the depths of my heart, I am aware that this prize is much more than an honor to me personally. Every time I take flight, I am always mindful of the many people who make a successful journey possible, the known pilots and the unknown ground crew. So Dr. Anderson, the Kings, Charles Sherrod, those were some of the leaders of the movement. But we know there were so many more people that played critical roles, that fed them, that transported people here and there, that gave them tips about what the establishment was doing. So he said, you honor the ground crew without whose labor and sacrifices the jet flights to freedom could never have left the earth. Most of these people will never make the headlines, and their names will not appear in Who's Who. Yet the years have rolled past, and when the blazing light of truth is focused on this marvelous age in which we live, men and women will know, and children will be taught. But guess what? They'll only be taught if we teach them, right? That we have a finer land, a better people, a more noble civilization, because these humble children of God were willing to suffer for righteousness' sake. So none of what happened to people, none of what happened to the brave citizens here in Albany and anywhere else across the country was justified. But people were willing to go through it to get to where we are. And then now we have a big role of making sure that our children understand this and making sure that I think that they honor that and that they live up to the legacy of all that blood that was spilled and all those heartaches that took place. So I want to share with you some of the people of St. Augustine, because as I said, Birmingham erupted, Bull Connor unleashed his dogs, and Congress was tussling with this. But you know how it is in Congress. Things will get to a stalemate and they'll get stuck. And then erupts St. Augustine. I'll tell you this about St. Augustine. St. Augustine is the oldest European settled city in America. Okay, they were celebrating their 400th anniversary in 1964. They had invited kings and queens and presidents from all over the world to St. Augustine to take part in this celebration. Everybody was invited to the party except who? Who was not invited? Take a guess. Black folk. Black folk weren't accepted. Now, if you were black, believe it or not, you could vote in St. Augustine. Now, what you couldn't do was all the other stuff. St. Augustine. And so the leaders of the St. Augustine, several things happened, and I'll get into a little of it later, but they asked the SCLC, and I know this was always one of those very careful things that ideally you wanted to come into a town because you were invited in, not like you just barged in and tried to do what you thought needed to happen. So they asked, actually Dr. King and the person that ended up going was, I think, Andy Young, but they went to Orlando from St. Augustine to meet with them, to tell them what they were experiencing in St. Augustine. Now, J.T. Johnson from Albany, he says the meanest, the most heartless segregationalist he ever ran into, and he said he was in movements in Mississippi and Alabama and Georgia, everywhere was in Florida and St. Augustine. He said they were just ruthless. Well, they met with them and they were trying to do a lot of things. They were trying to integrate the beaches. They were trying to integrate the restaurants. They were trying to integrate the five and dime stores, all of these things, and they met with very, very stiff resistance. Well, Henry Twine, they used to call him Matchbox Henry. Henry Twine was one of the key leaders of the St. Augustine movement. Now, Henry Twine met his wife, Cat Twine. He grew up somewhere else, and he moved to St. Augustine, and he was a mailman, and so every day he'd go on his route, and the Klan would harass him. They would follow him. We're going to get you. We're going to do this. We're going to do that. And they would tell him all the stuff they were going to do. And they were always looking for him to make a mistake so they could turn him in and get him fired. Well, Henry Twine, very quiet, very humble guy. He had this little matchbox. And he'd take out his matchbox, and every time he got confronted or challenged, he would write the date, the time, where he was, and what happened. So in other words, he was trying to protect himself by saying, I'm just doing my job, this is what's going on, and this is what happened. Well, later on, when the Civil Rights Act finally passed, and a lot of things I'm going to go through that happened before that happened, but when the Civil Rights Act of '64 finally passed, they were very excited. Henry Twine and two white lawyers went down to test the act. Okay, we're going to say, are these people going to honor the passage of this act? In many instances, you know, these things passed, but they passed on paper, and folks said, well, hell no, is basically what they said. So they go up to the Palms restaurant, a very hot day, as it usually is in Florida. Henry gets out of his car, the two lawyers get out of the car. Henry left his window halfway cracked because it was a hot day. Well, they're walking up the steps to go into the restaurant, and these group of Klansmen come after them with baseball bats and brass knuckles, and they start beating them. And Henry Twine is able to get back to his car and get his head and shoulders into the window, because the window was down, and so they kept raining blows on him until they eventually stopped. And he is convinced the only reason he lived that day was because he could get his head and shoulders into. So in other words, the law passed, but the law passing didn't mean anything to them. And so that is Henry Twine. Now, Cat Twine was Henry's wife, and they were fire and ice, because she was totally different to him. If you abuse her, you minimize her, you told her she couldn't do something, she was going to get in your face and tell you why that was unacceptable. So, as a little girl, she lived in this community and had to walk miles and miles to get to school. And she walked, of course, past the white school to get to the black school, the black side of town. And so these kids, the white kids, would ride by on the bus, and they'd throw stuff at her and call her a nigger and this, that, and the other. So her mom would take her downtown to McCrory's, which was one of those five and dime department stores. And she'd see the little white kids sitting up on the stool. You know, the stools in the five and dime, they don't have five and dimes anymore. How you sit on the stool, you can twirl around on the stool. And she talked about how the white kids could order a milkshake or a Coke or a hamburger, and she said, "Mom, why can't I do that?" And her mother struggled to tell her why she couldn't do it. So as she grew up, she was one of the people that went to Orlando to meet with Dr. King, and at that meeting I mentioned. And so as she grew up, and the interesting thing she always talked about, she said you could go into McCrory's and say there was a skirt or there was a hat. Well, black women and black men black woman had to hold the skirt up and hope it fit. She couldn't put that hat on her head. She couldn't try on those pair of shoes because they would be contaminated then, right? White folk wouldn't want to buy them. So, and they couldn't use the restrooms or the dressing rooms, but they wanted your money, but they didn't want to treat you like an equal human being. And so as she grew up, every single day, she and this one other lady would go down and they would picket McCrory's. They walk in front of the store with a sign talking about how, you know, you want our money, but you don't want to treat us with dignity and respect. So another thing I'll tell you about her, and she's very active also in the NAACP. So her husband comes home after trying to test his laws. He's mad as the dickens, as you can imagine. So maybe it's the next day, her and 3 or 4 other, these are, you know, the kind of the elite black women of St. Augustine. And so they go up to sit at the counter to see if they're going to get served. And of course, the bottom line is they did not get served. And in fact, the black wait staff in the back were so upset that they quit on the spot. They said, these aren't just, you know, anybody. These are the finest citizens in our community. If you're not going to serve them, then we're not going to work here. And so they call her ultimately the Rosa Parks of Florida. She did a bunch of things. I'm not going to go into all the details about Cat Twine, but a really amazing, amazing lady. In fact, so you see where they named that street after her, and she's wearing what they call a freedom hat. Very, very famous hat in Florida, and where all these people have signed it, and you have all these activists who have just basically pushed toward freedom. And right next to their house, right across the street from their house, is Twine Park, named after she and her husband. Very instrumental people. Now, who in here has met Hosea Williams? So are there anybody in here who's met Hosea Williams? Okay. Hosea Williams is a pretty amazing guy. He was cantankerous, he was radical, and all of it wasn't pretty. But Hosea Williams was born to blind parents in Attapogus, Georgia, way, way down, very, very rural. Hosea Williams used to say that growing up, he used to work from can't see to can't see. You know, it's like, and somebody had to explain that to me, having not been, you know, worked in an agrarian society. He said it started before it got dark and ended it was dark. So Hosea Williams, he was a pistol, and he was doing some things he probably shouldn't have been done, and so he was involved with some little white girl, and his grandfather, he was raised by his blind, his parents were blind, and he ended up being raised by his grandparents. Grandfather said, boy, you're going to have to get out of here or these white folk are going to kill you. So he shipped off to the army. He fought in France under General Patton, and he got, it's a phenomenal story, but he was in this platoon, and some sort of mortar hit the vehicle they were in, and everybody was killed except Hosea Williams. So he's on the way to the hospital, and he was in the hospital for, I don't know, between 4 and 6 months. And so they sent him back home with a Purple Heart. And so he was traveling somewhere in South Carolina, and he got off the bus. And he goes in, you know, the bus stations were segregated. You had white and colored, and you had the white and colored fountain. So he goes and takes a drink from the white fountain. They sat upon him and beat him so bad, he spent 4 more months in the hospital. And so in the hospital, he said, I had to ask myself, was I fighting for the right side or not? And you know, so there was a lot of that was taking place, I think, back in the 40s and 50s when, you know, people were, it's just like many of y'all may remember how people like W.E. Du Bois and the great, I'm trying to remember his name now, the great, he was a thespian, he was an actor, he was a great, Paul Robeson. All of them were being courted by communists. And to me, it's like they were just looking for anybody that would see their cause as just and would respect them as people. So anyway, Hosea Williams came out and he hadn't finished high school. He moved to Atlanta and he had this mentor who told him he needed to finish, and then he ended up enrolling in Morris Brown College and in Atlanta, and worked really hard and did really well, and then ultimately became the first black federal scientist in the South. And it's an amazing thing, he moved to Savannah and he thought he was living really well and didn't realize that he was their token. And he said it all the time. He said, I didn't realize I was their token nigga. And so he then pushed against the system and started every day at lunch, he would go down to the park and stand on the statue of this Indian, Tamatichi, in this square in Savannah, and he would preach fire and freedom and justice for 30 minutes, and he'd go back to work. And of course, they ended up firing his radical behind. And so that's when he got connected with Dr. King and the SCLC. Bloody Sunday, if y'all have seen the pictures, and I know you have, of Bloody Sunday, when they're waiting to cross the bridge, the 2 people in front, and the one everybody remembers is John Lewis. But right next to John Lewis was Hosea Williams when they were trying to cross the Edmund Pettus Bridge, and they were the tear gas and the horses on the guys on horseback beat them back across the bridge. He was Dr. King's field general, and legend has it that he was jailed 120 times and shed blood in 20 states and marched with 37 people who were martyred in the civil rights movement. And anybody recognize that person who was standing next to him? Who was that standing next to Hosea Williams in the picture? Could you go back one, please? Yeah. Oh, one more. Who is that next to Hosea Williams? Anybody recognize that? Lou Rawls, yeah, Lou Rawls. And so one of the things that they certainly did, and you all know who a lot of those folk are, Harry Belafonte and many of those that Dick Gregory certainly, that they engaged them to help, and they drew many of the white people who were Marlon Brando and Peter, Paul, and Mary, who saw this as a just cause and wanted to be engaged and wanted to take part. So there he is. Okay, let me see, did I remember it? Yes, okay. So there, of course, is Hosea Williams. There's Dr. King. And this was the March Against Fear. This was after James Meredith had been shot down in Mississippi. And all the civil rights groups said, we're not going to let it in here. We're going to all converge on Mississippi, and we're going to continue Meredith's march. And that gentleman right there, anybody recognize that? Stokely Carmichael. Our first grandson, who I just left Oakland with, my son's a little radical, but his name is Ture, for Kwame Ture. So yes, so they all came together in this instance, in this March Against Fear. And there's Hosea Williams at the last bridge crossing, you know, the annual anniversary of Bloody Sunday, the first Sunday in March every year. And there next to him is a lady called Marching Lily Brown, and she was beaten very badly on that day of the bridge crossing. And anybody recognize that lady right there, barely in the corner in the background? Who is that? Shirley Franklin. She was kind of, to say it in that instance, way back then, a bit player. Not that this was that long ago either. But Willie Bolden, I called him the Wagonmaster. Willie grew up in South Carolina. He really isn't a Savannah native, but he cut his teeth in Savannah. And you know, right after Dr. King was killed, the Poor People's Campaign, and they were committed to continue with the Poor People's Campaign. And the Poor People's Campaign, many people believe that was the reason he was killed, because he wasn't just talking about, you know, civil rights and voting rights anymore. He was talking about redistribution of the wealth and challenging that aspect of system. So the Poor People's March began in Marks, Mississippi, and there's Willie Bolden with the people. You see all the wagon trains there, and they actually literally took this wagon train all the way to Washington, D.C., and was pulling poor people, Latinos, Native Americans, Asian Americans, poor whites, coal miners from Kentucky, all together to say to this country that injustice is here and you need to do something about it. Well, he was very involved in St. Augustine, integrating the restaurants on the beaches, and so many stories I could tell you about Willie, but I'll say this, that he eventually, if he didn't think he could do it, and he was encouraged by Dr. Bernard Lafayette, to go back to school, and he ended up getting his master's degree from Harvard and became the class marshal there. He's a labor leader, a school board negotiator, lots of things. There's Willie Bolden right there at a march in Americus, Georgia. And he was somebody else, he's a pastor now at this point in time. There's Willie. And anybody recognize that gentleman right there? James Orange, look at you. James Orange is another just awesome individual. There is y'all's homeboy, J.T. Johnson. Anybody know J.T.? Yeah? Okay, so there's there's a picture of him here in the museum. J.T. tells me that when he was in high school, his senior year, he said he was the fastest guy in Georgia, and said he wanted to go to University of Georgia or Georgia Tech, but not only had they not accepted their first black athlete, they hadn't accepted their first black student. So he got disillusioned and went to New York. And so he's in New York working, and he sees on TV about all these clashes and all this violence and the sit-ins and everything going on here in Albany. So he wants to come back and get involved. So he does return to Albany and did a lot of things. After Dr. King was assassinated, he traveled extensively with Ralph David Abernathy, and so he was his person that he relied on as his confidant and his person to help him through a lot of things and to get what he needed to get done. One of the things I want to tell you about JT, though, and in fact, right next to JT, of course, there's Hosea Williams. My light doesn't want to act right. There's Leon Hall there. But the thing I'll tell you about JT is this. They wanted to integrate, some of y'all have seen the instance, some of the pictures of them integrating the beaches down in St. Augustine. Some of the white segregationists are out in the water, like 3 feet, and they're holding sticks and they're holding bats, and they're waiting on the black folk to wade into the water to try and integrate the beaches. And when they came into the water, they jumped on them. Some of them, they tried to drown them. And yet these black folk were committed to being nonviolent. Well, there was this famous swimming pool. And, well, the pool wasn't famous then, but they had made this plan to integrate the swimming pool. And there was white and black together, and car pulled around the corner, and they let them out, and they jumped over the fence, and they jumped into the pool. Well, the manager of the pool was a man by the name of James Brock, ardent racist, segregationist. Was a very famous picture that went all the way around the world. He went into the back and got some acid, and the picture shows him throwing the acid in the swimming pool. You can see the acid is caught in mid-air by the cameraman. And then there's another very famous picture of this policeman jumping in with this full uniform. He's just like this up in the middle of the air. And so they showed this picture in China, in Russia, and all over and they're saying, well, here this is America, land of great opportunity, where everybody's equal and everybody's free, and see how they're treating their citizens. So it was one of those things that was a great opportunity for us to highlight the indifference and injustice that was going on here. So there is JT on the right. You know who that is next to him. These two people were getting married, and there's Hosea Williams. So there's JT. And JT, just like every single other one of these people I know, they're still very much on the front line, still very active and very ardent and involved. Like JT's whole thing is working with young people, helping young people understand the power of nonviolence and the power of self-respect. So there's JT a few years ago standing at that pool that he integrated in St. Augustine. And this was when they all came together, when Hosea Williams went into the hospital. He never made it out. And of course there's Lula Williams, who has a great story of her own. There's Willie Bolden and C.T. Vivian. Robert Haling's the last person I want to share with you on. Robert Haling was the leader of the St. Augustine movement. Now, Robert Haling was one person who, frankly, wasn't nonviolent. Robert Haling was, he went to dental school at Meharry, and there was a lot of activism going on. He went and joined the Air Force, and he was on his way back home to Tallahassee, Florida. He flew in somewhere, and he's on the bus, and the white bus driver told Robert Haling, "You go to the back of the bus." Robert Haling said, "I'm not going to the back of the bus." So the bus driver gets on, I guess it was a phone, whatever kind of communication system he had, and he calls ahead to the bus station and said, "We got one of them uppity here we'll be in there in a little while." So when the bus pulled in Tallahassee, Robert Haling let everybody get off the bus, and he eyed who the people were that were out there to whoop up on him, and he picked out the smallest one. He went over and he was able to wrestle the weapon away from him, and the fight was on. But there were several of the black cab drivers that were there too that joined in support of him. Well, a lot of them ended up in the hospital, but he didn't have the worst of it. But anyway, his dad was very prominent there in town, and the police chief said, look, because he was an officer in the military, he said, look, we can have him court-martialed, but all I'm going to say is I don't want him coming back to town as long as I'm the police chief here, and so we're going to let him go this time. But he was unbought, truly like Hosea Williams, unbought and unbossed. So when we went to St. Augustine to take over the practice of this very respected guy who was retiring, and he did lots of great stuff. He was involved with the NAACP, and his issue was all around youth. He was teaching young people, young girls, to not get pregnant, people not to get hooked on alcohol and drugs, go to school, all the things that young people need to go. He was very strong there about that. When these companies would go on strike and out of business, he would treat these people, even though they didn't have insurance. Very, very outstanding individual as he organized these youth and college students. Well, this is the interesting thing about Hosea Williams. Robert Haling. He had this cadre of people that he would, he almost ran it like a military unit, and they would spy on the opposition and know what was going on. And so they were spying on this Klan rally one day, and a guy named Connie Lynch, who called himself a reverend, and J.B. Stoner, some of you all have heard of him, a lawyer, a white racist lawyer. They were up there railing on the stage. There's a rally, hundreds of people here. They were burning a big cross, and they were rallying, talking about that burrhead nigger Dennis, and we need to get him. And right then, these people, I don't know how far away they were, they caught 3 of them, and they pulled them up in front of this rally on this stage, and they started beating them. And they beat them all into a state of unconsciousness. They knocked out, they identified Dr. Haling as the leader and the dentist. They knocked out 12 of his teeth, broke his ribs, stacked them like firewood. And probably the only reason they didn't set him on fire was the fact that just about 16 days earlier was the bombing of the 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham. So somebody called the police and they stopped it. Well, later on, they all went to trial. Nothing happened to any of the people that beat Robert Haling. And Robert Haling was charged with possession of a weapon because they found a .22 in his glove compartment. So that's when the SCLC came and got involved. But he was he was not going to give in to anybody. And he was just an amazing gentleman, still living to the next one. And there's Robert Haling, still ramrod strong and 80-something years old now. And so it's been a great pleasure for me to have the chance to personally meet all these people. And you know, one of the things, I'll close with this story. And there's this gentleman that I met in Atlanta, and he, when I met him, well, before I met him, he was about 6'7". He was a hellion too. Now he drank hard, cussed hard, fought hard. Used to beat his wife consistently. And one day he had beat his wife one time too many, and father-in-law came up and shot him 3 times. So by the time I met him, he was in a wheelchair. Come to know the Lord in a real and genuine way. He had a real come to Jesus meeting. And what was amazing to me about him, he had this ability to look at young brothers right dead in the eye, and they would, I mean, he had their attention, and they would follow him. I've never seen a ministry that had so many young brothers that were involved, they were engaged, and they were sold out to being change agents. And I always believed that he was going to get up out of that wheelchair one day, and because he was so powerful, but indeed he did not. But one of the things that he said to me, and I'll leave this with you, because keep in mind, the only thing necessary, the only white person I'm going to quote here tonight is Sir Edmund Burke, and he was a Welsh philosopher and statesman. He said, the only thing necessary for evil to triumph is for good men and good women to do nothing. And so just like the people, the great citizens, the patriarchs and the matriarchs here in Albany, you didn't stand by while this injustice was reigning. You challenged it. And so that's what he said. He says, so keep in mind as we move on through life, where could we go? And what could we do if we refuse to doubt that things could be better, and that we can be better, and we can make a difference? If we refuse to doubt as much as we refuse to believe. So it's been my pleasure to spend a few minutes with you all today. Thank you so much.
Let me remind you that community night for the month of June will be June 26th. Our guest will be the Superintendent of Schools, David Mosley, the President of Albany Tech, Dr. Anthony Carter, the Interim President of Albany State, Dr. Art Dunning, and the Interim President of Darden College, Dr. Paul Jones. These educators will be here to talk about the future of education in Dougherty County. That will be June the 26th at 6:30, and we invite you to come out. Again, thank you for coming, and good evening.